My name is Clara Bennett. I'm 29 years old. 6 weeks before my wedding, my sister Vanessa called with what she described as a tiny scheduling problem. She had just booked her gender reveal brunch. Same day, same afternoon, almost the exact same hour as my ceremony. When I reminded her my wedding had been planned for months, she laughed softly and said something I'll never forget. "You can have a wedding anytime, Clara. This is my first baby." Minutes later, she wrote in the family group chat, "If anyone has to choose, please come where family really matters." On June 21st, I walked down the aisle in a garden with 42 chairs. 35 of them were empty. 1 week later, those same relatives sent 417 messages after seeing where my husband and I spent our honeymoon. Before I tell you why that happened, drop your city in the comments. I always wonder how far stories like this travel. I grew up in Charleston, South Carolina, in a family that looked perfect from the outside. The Bennett house stood on a quiet street lined with oak trees and old brick sidewalks. Our home was large, bright, and frequently full of guests. Dinner parties, charity fundraisers, and holiday gatherings happened so often that the dining room table sometimes felt more like a stage than a place to eat. My father, Robert Bennett, was a commercial attorney whose name appeared on several business boards in the city. My mother, Linda Bennett, was well known in Charleston's charity circles. She organized fundraising galas, chaired nonprofit committees, and spent much of her time attending events that were photographed for local magazines. From the outside, our family looked like the kind people admired. But inside our house, there was a quiet rule that nobody ever said out loud. Everything revolved around my sister, Vanessa Bennett. Vanessa was 3 years older than me, and from the time we were children, she had been what people politely call the golden child. She was beautiful, confident, and completely comfortable being the center of attention. Teachers praised her. Neighbors complimented her. Relatives talked about her as if success followed her naturally. But the moment that truly changed our family's dynamic came when Vanessa married Daniel Whitmore. Daniel came from one of the most established real estate families in the Charleston area. His parents owned several coastal developments, and the Whitmore name carried a level of financial influence that opened doors in almost every social circle. After the wedding, things in our household shifted quickly. My parents suddenly began living more comfortably than they had before. Daniel quietly helped them refinance part of their mortgage. My mother started using a credit card connected to the Whitmore family accounts. Dinner parties became more elaborate, and the wine on the table was noticeably more expensive. Vanessa was no longer just the older daughter. She became the pride of the family. People said it openly. "We're so proud of Vanessa," my mother would tell guests. Compared to that, my life looked very different. I was an illustrator. More specifically, I illustrated children's books, the kind filled with soft watercolor animals and quiet landscapes meant to make bedtime stories feel magical. I worked freelance. I lived in a small studio apartment, and in my family's vocabulary, my career had a special label. They called it a hobby that pays sometimes. Everything changed the day I met Eli Mercer. We met at a small art fair in Savannah, Georgia. It wasn't the kind of polished event my parents would attend. The booths were handmade, the artists stood behind their own tables, and the air smelled faintly of wood shavings and paint. Eli's booth stood in the corner. His sculptures were made from reclaimed wood and pieces of old metal, shaped into forms that felt both delicate and powerful at the same time. He didn't talk much, but when he did speak about his work, something remarkable happened. His quiet voice carried an intensity that made you feel like you were seeing the world the way he did, full of hidden shapes waiting to be discovered. We fell in love faster than either of us expected. My family disliked him almost immediately. The first time Eli met them was during Thanksgiving dinner. Vanessa arrived carrying 2 bottles of wine that cost $180 each. My mother placed them carefully on the table as if they were rare artifacts. I arrived with a homemade pumpkin pie. No one mentioned it. During dinner, my father turned toward Eli with a polite smile that felt rehearsed. "So, Eli," he asked casually, "when are you planning to get a real job?" Daniel laughed quietly beside Vanessa. Vanessa tilted her head and added, in a voice that sounded almost sympathetic, "Well, at least Clara found someone creative." The words landed like a gentle insult. Eli didn't argue. Instead, beneath the table, he reached for my hand and squeezed it softly. That was his way. He didn't fight for attention. He focused on his work. A few months later, we rented a studio space beneath an old Charleston house where Eli could sculpt and I could draw. The house belonged to a quiet man named Julian Hart. Julian was nearly 70 years old and always dressed in worn jackets that smelled faintly of coffee. He drank black coffee every morning and occasionally came downstairs to watch Eli work. Sometimes he would stand quietly for several minutes before speaking. "The light on that edge," he would say thoughtfully, pointing at a sculpture. "Warm it slightly." When Eli adjusted the piece the way Julian suggested, the entire sculpture would suddenly feel different, more balanced, more alive. I assumed Julian was simply an older man who loved art. What I didn't realize then was that he wasn't just watching Eli create, he was evaluating him. Eli proposed to me in January. There was no diamond ring. Instead, he carved a ring from a piece of reclaimed walnut wood he had been saving in the studio. The surface was polished until it felt warm and smooth against my finger, and the grain of the wood curved like quiet waves around the band. It was the most beautiful ring I had ever seen. We didn't want a large wedding. Neither of us enjoyed grand ceremonies or crowded ballrooms. What we wanted was something simple and real, something that felt like us. So we planned a small garden wedding in Charleston, 42 guests, wildflowers instead of elaborate arrangements, and a wooden arch that Eli built himself in the studio, carefully shaping the frame from driftwood he had collected along the coast. When I called my parents to tell them the date, my father sounded genuinely happy. "June 21st, he repeated. "That's perfect," he said. "And of course I'll walk you down the aisle." I believed him. For the next 3 months, everything seemed normal. The venue confirmed our reservation, Naomi helped me finalize the invitations, and Eli spent evenings finishing the wooden arch that would stand at the end of the aisle. Then, one afternoon in early spring, my phone rang. The caller was my Aunt Patricia. Her voice sounded casual, almost cheerful. "Honey," she said, "are you going to Vanessa's gender reveal too?" I stood still in the middle of my kitchen. "What gender reveal?" I asked. There was a brief pause. "Oh," my aunt said, suddenly sounding uncomfortable. "I thought you knew." She explained that Vanessa had booked a gender reveal brunch at the Charleston Harbor Club. The date she mentioned made my stomach drop. June 21st, the same day as my wedding. After the call ended, I immediately dialed Vanessa. She answered on the second ring. "Hey, Clara," she said brightly. I tried to keep my voice steady. "Did you schedule your gender reveal on June 21st? There was a short pause before she replied. "Oh," she said lightly. "I didn't realize the venue only had that date available." Her tone sounded innocent, but something about the explanation didn't feel right. A few hours later, Rachel, one of my closest friends, sent me a screenshot. It was a digital invitation for Vanessa's gender reveal. The timestamp on the invitation showed it had been sent out 2 weeks before my wedding save the date cards. Vanessa hadn't discovered a scheduling conflict. She had created one. That evening, a new message appeared in the Bennett family group chat. It was from Vanessa. "Clara's ceremony is small and casual anyway," she wrote. "If anyone has to choose, please come where family really matters." I stared at the message for a long time. At first, I assumed people would ignore it, but the next day, Rachel called me again. "You should see this," she said quietly. She sent another screenshot. Vanessa had been calling relatives individually. In one message, she wrote to my father, "Clara will understand. She always does." The words felt strangely familiar, because she was right. For most of my life, I had been the person who understood, the person who adjusted, the person who stepped aside when Vanessa needed something. But this time, the consequences became visible very quickly. When the RSVP responses started arriving for my wedding, the pattern was impossible to ignore. 38 relatives had been invited. 24 declined. Almost all of them wrote the same polite explanation. We already promised Vanessa we'd attend the gender reveal. By the end of the week, the reality was clear. My sister hadn't accidentally scheduled her celebration on the same day as my wedding. She had placed the entire family in a position where they had to choose, and most of them had already decided where they would be. The morning of my wedding began earlier than I expected. At 7:15 a.m., my phone rang while I was standing in the small guest room of the inn where I was getting ready. Outside the window, the sky above the marshland was still pale with early morning light. The caller ID showed my father's name. For a moment, I simply stared at the screen before answering. "Hi, Dad." His voice sounded hesitant, the way it does when someone already knows the conversation won't end well. "Clara," he said, "I don't think we can make it today." The words felt strangely calm, almost rehearsed. I closed my eyes for a moment. "What do you mean you can't make it?" There was a pause on the line. "The drive from Vanessa's event is longer than we expected," he said carefully. I felt my chest tighten. "You promised to walk me down the aisle," I said quietly. Another pause followed. "You'll have other moments," my father replied. The sentence landed heavier than anything else he could have said, because we both knew that wasn't true. I hung up the phone without saying goodbye. The venue for our wedding sat behind a small coastal inn outside Charleston, overlooking a wide stretch of marsh grass that moved gently in the wind. The garden itself was simple, but beautiful. 42 white chairs were arranged in 2 neat rows facing the wooden arch Eli had built. A small bundle of lavender was tied to the back of each chair with thin white ribbon. When the wind moved through the garden, the scent drifted softly through the air. It should have felt peaceful. Instead, the empty chairs were impossible to ignore. Naomi arrived first. She hugged me tightly the moment she stepped into the garden. "They're the ones missing something today," she said. 2 of Eli's closest friends arrived shortly after that, followed by 2 friends I had known since college. Julian Hart walked in quietly a few minutes later, wearing a navy suit that looked old but perfectly pressed. And of course, Eli was already there. When we counted everyone standing in the garden, the number came to 7. 7 people. 35 chairs remained empty. The ceremony was scheduled to begin at 11. I stood at the start of the narrow garden path that served as our aisle, holding the small bouquet of wildflowers Naomi had helped me arrange earlier that morning. There was no one beside me, no music, no father waiting to take my arm. For a moment, I considered simply walking alone. Then I heard footsteps behind me. When I turned around, Julian Hart was standing there. Up close, the navy suit looked carefully maintained despite its age. The tie was simple, the shoes polished. He looked at me with a calm expression. "Your father should be here," he said gently. I nodded. "But someone who values you should," he added. Then he offered me his arm. I took it. Together we walked down the aisle. At the end of the path, Eli stood beneath the wooden arch he had built with his own hands. The moment he saw me approaching, his composure disappeared. Tears filled his eyes. Naomi was crying too. By the time we reached the front of the garden, I realized I was crying as well. The ceremony itself lasted 12 minutes. There were no elaborate speeches, no large audience, and no dramatic music. Just 7 people standing in a quiet garden while Eli and I promised to spend our lives together. It was the most honest moment I had ever experienced. After the ceremony, we moved a few tables onto the grass. Someone ordered pizza. A bottle of wine appeared. We laughed, talked, and danced barefoot in the garden as the afternoon sunlight slowly faded. At one point, I checked my phone. There were no messages from my family, Not one. Curious, I opened Instagram. Vanessa had already posted 14 photos from her gender reveal brunch. Pink and blue decorations filled the room behind her. Balloons hung from the ceiling, and everyone in the pictures looked perfectly dressed and cheerful. The caption beneath the photos read only 4 words: "Family is everything." I stared at the screen for a long moment. Then I locked my phone and set it aside. Because the 7 people standing in that garden had already shown me something my family never had: what real support actually looks like. 2 weeks after our wedding, Julian Hart knocked on the studio door one morning. Eli and I were sitting at our work table drinking coffee when we heard his slow footsteps coming down the staircase from the house above. He carried 2 mugs of black coffee and a small wooden box tucked under his arm. "Come upstairs," he said. "I'd like to show you something." We followed him into the old kitchen of the house he owned. The room smelled faintly of roasted coffee and old wood, the kind of scent that settles into buildings that have existed for more than a century. Julian placed the wooden box on the table. "Before we open this," he said calmly, "there's something I should explain." For months, I had assumed Julian was simply a retired man who loved art enough to watch Eli work. He always offered small observations about light, balance, or texture, but he never spoke about himself. Now he leaned back slightly in his chair. "For 24 years, he said, "I ran Hart Gallery in Savannah." The words hung in the air for a moment before they fully registered. Hart Gallery was one of the most respected independent galleries in the region. Artists from across the Southeast had launched their careers through exhibitions there. Eli looked at him carefully. "You owned it?" he asked. Julian nodded. "I retired a few years ago," he said, "but I still know a few people." Then he opened the box. Inside were several printed catalogs, a few magazine clippings, and a collection of photographs showing gallery exhibitions from past years. Some of the pages had small notes written in Julian's careful handwriting. I was still trying to understand what he was showing us when he turned one photograph toward Eli. "6 months ago," Julian said, "I sent some images of your sculptures to a collector." Eli frowned slightly. "You did?" Julian nodded again. "The collector's name is Victor Ashcroft." I had heard that name before. Victor Ashcroft was known in international art circles as someone who supported emerging artists long before the rest of the market noticed them. Julian slid another sheet of paper across the table. "It started with one purchase," he said. The document showed a transaction record. Victor Ashcroft had purchased one of Eli's sculptures. Price: $90,000. Eli stared at the number as if it belonged to someone else. "That can't be right," he said quietly. Julian smiled. It was only the beginning. He reached into the box again and pulled out another document. This one was a formal contract. Victor Ashcroft had commissioned a new body of work from Eli. The total value of the commission was $480,000. I felt my breath catch for a moment. Julian leaned forward. "A gallery in New York wants to host a solo exhibition once the series is finished," he explained. He paused before adding one final detail. "The working title for the series is The 42 Chairs." For a moment, none of us spoke. Eli finally looked up from the papers. "You sent my work without telling me," he said slowly. Julian met his eyes calmly. "I wanted to be sure first," he replied. "Sure of what?" Eli asked. Julian gestured toward the studio downstairs. "That you were serious." Later that week, something even more unexpected happened. My phone rang one afternoon while Eli and I were finishing lunch. The caller introduced himself as Victor Ashcroft. His voice was calm and warm, carrying the relaxed confidence of someone who had spent decades in the art world. "I heard about your wedding," he said, "and I also heard some of the circumstances around it." I didn't ask how. "In small art communities, stories travel quickly." Victor continued. "A honeymoon shouldn't begin with disappointment," he said. Then he made an offer that left me completely speechless. He invited Eli and me to spend 10 days on his yacht along the Amalfi Coast in Italy. No meetings, he said. No contracts to discuss. Just time to celebrate the beginning of something new. Eli looked at me across the table. Neither of us had ever imagined a honeymoon like that. We accepted, and we told no one in my family, not my parents, not Vanessa, not anyone from Charleston, because for the first time in our lives, the future we were stepping into didn't depend on their approval. Our honeymoon began quietly along the Amalfi Coast. Victor Ashcroft's yacht was anchored just outside a small harbor where pastel-colored buildings climbed up the cliffs above the sea. The water was impossibly blue, the kind of color that almost looks painted rather than real. For the first 2 days, Eli and I did very little. We walked along narrow coastal streets, ate long lunches at small restaurants overlooking the water, and spent evenings watching the sun sink slowly behind the mountains. After the chaos of the wedding and the silence from my family, the calm felt almost surreal. On the third night, I decided to post a single photo. The picture showed me standing near the front of the yacht while Eli leaned casually against the railing behind me. The Mediterranean stretched out in every direction, bright and endless beneath the late evening light. I wrote a short caption, "Honeymoon with my husband, grateful for the people who showed up." Then I set my phone aside and went to sleep. The next morning, I woke up to the sound of my phone vibrating nonstop on the nightstand. At first, I thought something had gone wrong, but when I opened the screen, the notification counter told a very different story. 417 unread messages. Most of them came from numbers I recognized immediately. My father, my mother, Vanessa, Daniel, relatives who had chosen the gender reveal over my wedding. The first message from my father was simple. "Whose yacht is that?" A few minutes later, another one appeared. "Clara, we didn't realize Eli was doing so well." My mother's messages followed quickly after that. "Why didn't you tell us Marcus was successful?" "Is this part of his gallery connections?" Vanessa's texts sounded almost frantic. "Wait, is Eli actually famous now? Is that the Amalfi Coast?" Daniel's message was even more predictable. "We should connect about potential investment opportunities." Some of the relatives who had declined my wedding invitation sent messages that sounded strangely supportive. "We always believed in you. So proud of what you've built." I read every message slowly, not because I needed their approval, but because I wanted to understand something that had taken me years to see clearly. When I needed them, most of them had chosen convenience. Now that success appeared nearby, they suddenly wanted to stand close again. For several hours, I didn't respond. The sea outside the window shimmered under the afternoon sun, and Eli sat beside me, sketching ideas for the sculpture series he was beginning to plan. Finally, I opened the family group chat. I typed one message. "Eli signed a major commission 6 weeks ago. The yacht belongs to his patron, Victor Ashcroft. Your absence on my wedding day hurt more than you probably realize. I need time." Then I turned the phone off. The quiet that followed felt heavier than the noise had. 3 months later, Eli's exhibition opened in New York. More than 200 people attended the opening night. At the center of the gallery stood the largest piece in the entire show. A wide sculptural installation built from wood and metal. 42 chairs. 7 of them were occupied. 35 were empty. The title of the piece was simple, June 21st. The price listed beside it read $120,000, and before the evening ended, it had already been sold. If you've ever been the person standing in front of empty chairs while someone else filled the room, then you probably understand this story better than most. Sometimes the people who leave reveal more than the people who stay. And sometimes the strongest thing you can do is stop counting who walked away and start valuing the ones who remained. If stories like Clara's resonate with you, consider subscribing, because the people who stay are often the ones worth listening to.